Hello, everybody. My name is Joan Casey, and I'm the founder and president of Educational Advocates College Consulting. And we have been in practice for 20 years. We have a small team of consultants who um, have really enjoyed working with some wonderful students and parents over the years, some of whom will be on this webinar watching tonight. So during this meeting, if you have any questions as we go, feel free to put them in the chat, and I will answer those at the end of the meeting. So I'm going to share my screen and bring up the presentation. So tonight we're going to talk about what you need to know about college admissions in 2024. And there is a lot to know. So um, we'll get into as much as we can, as much detail, and we'll be doing some other webinars in January for our spring webinar series where we'll go into more detail. So our agenda tonight, we want you to have an understanding of what happens inside the admission office. It will help you and your children understand like how an application is read and why some of the puzzling things that you hear about occur. We'll touch on the holistic review, what that means, some of the tools that are used in admissions, and then we're going to shift and talk about the testing landscape and how that's evolving. We'll discuss a little bit on majors and then just in general some overall trends. So you might hear this term holistic review if you're a junior parent, maybe you've already brought your child to some college visits, but essentially it's what many colleges do, and it's a comprehensive review of a student that goes beyond grades and test scores. So they're looking at, who is this student as a person? They're trying to get to know them through the recommendations in the essays and looking at demographic information, what is their high school like? And the goal of a holistic review is to help the college see the student as more than just the numbers. But of course, that has limitations because colleges at the end of the day do really care about grades, and some of them care about the rigor of the curriculum. So, meaning, there are schools that are perfectly fine if a student doesn't have many honors or any AP classes, and that's in line with who they accept. And then there are other colleges where it's expected that students will engage in an AP or an IB curriculum. So, most colleges will use something called Slate, and it's a customer relationship management program, and it allows them to track all kinds of data and interactions with the student. So let's take a look at an example. So here you can see at the very top in yellow on the top left-hand corner, it says watch flag related to a Board of Trustees member. So colleges right away can know if this student has some kind of a special status, the grandchild of a major donor or maybe an athletic recruit or some other kind of notable quality that the admissions readers want to know about. If you look under biographic, it will tell a little bit about citizenship. Okay, of course, race is no longer going to be in Slate because of the Supreme Court decision, so that won't be there. This is a little bit of an older example. And then you can see where it talks about enroll released right under there, you see a blue arrow, and you can see that there's been a first read. So every college will read applications in a slightly different way. Some, and I would say probably moderately selective to less selective. Sometimes there's just one reader and they make a decision. At other colleges, there might be two people that read the application. In fact, sometimes they split it, like one person will read one half and the other reads the other half. And then if they don't agree on the decision, then it would go to a committee. And then at still other schools, and this often happens at very selective schools, is that everybody goes to committee. And so even though there are readers that have made comments, everybody will discuss every applicant. So again, the colleges never do anything the same. So there's all these nuances. You can see on this next page that Slate will dig even deeper, and they can track all the interactions that a student has with the college. So Obviously when you register for a visit, this will be logged in Slate. If do an interview, if you are able to register online for a virtual event, sometimes those you have to register for. But even like everyday surprising things like email activity, students can get an email and they'll know whether they click on it or not. Now, that should not cause students to panic and think they have to just like open every email and go crazy clicking everything, because I don't really feel like the colleges have all that much time to look at this in detail. However, if a student is interested and is planning to apply to a school, they do need to demonstrate some interest, and that's more important at some colleges than at others. There's another tool that many colleges use. It's offered through College Board, and it's what's called a landscape score. So a score is provided based on a variety of factors, and there's a 1 to 100 scale. A one would mean there's no adversity in this particular community where this school is located, and 100 would mean there's extreme adversity. So meaning it's maybe a low income area, and the reason this is important information is it helps the college understand the student in the context of their school and the community where they live. But it's just one factor. It's a small factor. Um, you know, Students are often read in groups with their classmates anyway. So, there's often, like, for example, a regional reader that will read everybody from a certain high school. So usually they're quite familiar with the various high schools, but not always. Other things that go into shape a class are things like gender. So, for example, if you look at this first white block on the left, California Institute of Technology, you can see that they have many more men applying than women. And so, therefore, in a rare case, this is a case where women are admitted at a higher rate than men. As many of you may be aware, there are more women that are going to college these days than men. So often it's the opposite at most schools, is that boys might get a little leg up in the admissions process, because there's usually more women applicants. Geographic diversity can matter in some instances. So you can see in the middle block, we have Loyola University, Maryland. And if you look at the very bottom, they have about 70% of their enrolled students are from out of state. And then compare that to St. Bonaventure University in New York. And St. Bonaventure is only about 22% out of state. So that might be the case of a school that's looking to have more geographic diversity and is looking to have more out of state students. Other things like unique talents, so that could be, music, art, um, athletic ability if a student's a recruited athlete, and, ethnicity, but not so much race anymore since the Supreme Court ruling. That ruling did allow students to talk about their backgrounds in their essays, and we did see, among primarily the most selective colleges, there was definitely a decrease in the number of Black and Latino students in this most recent cycle. Now, how your high school also affects how you're viewed. So, colleges want to look to see that the student is taking advantage of the opportunities that are offered to them. So, if a student goes to a school with a very rich curriculum, of a lot of advanced classes or IB classes, and they're not taking advantage of very many of them. However, they're applying to very selective schools that really want to see rigor in the curriculum. Then the college is going to look at that and wonder why. And that so those highly selective colleges might not be the right fit for that particular student. Students are often, as I mentioned earlier, read or compared in groups, and so they can see like how rigorous the course of study is and how it compares to other students in their school. Sometimes they even have um, access to prior students that are already enrolled in the school, and they can even see how those enrolled students from that particular high school are performing at the college. So that's also information that they have at their fingertips. Now, you might think, "Oh, that isn't good. My child is applying, early decision to wash you and, or isn't really sure they're gonna apply. They might do early decision too, and, I'm worried that if, 3 students get in early decision 1, then my child doesn't have a chance." But that's not always true. So you wanna think about comparison, not competition. If they're really highly qualified students, then there definitely can be more than a handful of students admitted to a given college from any given high school. And there are resources. There's Naviance and Score that many schools use. There are scattergrams that can help students understand where they fall in terms of chance of admission. They have their limitations. Sometimes they're not complete or updated, or not all students report the information back to their school counselor, but they're a really great place to start, as are conversations with consultants and school counselors, because they understand, a high school's relationship with various colleges. There's also a document called the school profile. And for most public schools, it's readily available on the website. Some independent and boarding schools, you have to ask the school counselor, but it's something that gets sent to colleges, and it explains the high school. And it's really a helpful document for parents to take a look at and students to look at, so they understand how their high school is being described to the colleges. So we're going to shift now and talk and explain what yield and enrollment management are. So first, yield. So yield is the percent of students who accept a college's offer of admission. And so, that can really vary. So like last year, Harvard's yield was 83%, proving that not everybody that gets into Harvard decides to go there. I think Northeastern went from like a 33% yield, 3 or 4 years ago, to a 50% yield last year. Many liberal arts colleges, including selective ones, they're probably more in like the 30-35 range. And lots of colleges that are moderately selective will only about 20% of those they admit. So of course that's why colleges admit more students than they actually have spaces for, because they know not everybody will come. So why is yield important? Like, why do colleges care about this? So we're going to talk about enrollment management in a minute, but it factors into rankings for one thing, and colleges are very concerned about rankings because they know parents and students look at them. We consultants often wish they wouldn't look at them because we don't feel it's a great way to evaluate a school, but they're there and people do look at them. So a college can really, brag and say like, wow, X percent, this very high percent of students we admitted came to our college. And it also offers a level of security because the enrollment management team's job is to bring in a class, and to bring in a class um, that will, meet the goals that have been set by the president and the board of trustees. So one of the things that colleges do is they implement what's called yield protection strategies. So this is things like using early decision and restricted early action, so that they can fill their class. And so this is why we're seeing these days, a college might fill like maybe 50-60% of their class through the 2 rounds of early decision, making the regular decision round, more challenging to get into. And they do this because they have a job to do. They have to bring in a class, and this ensures that they have a good number of students that are qualified and in line with the objectives of the university in place, fairly early in the year. This is also why you may have heard of, a student applying to a college where they were their grades and scores were well above the average, but they were waitlisted or deferred. And sometimes that can happen because um, colleges don't really think they're going to come. They have predictive models, and they can say, you know what, based on this student's profile, it's unlikely they're going to come. They're probably using us as a backup. They may even look and see that the student really hasn't shown much interest. Other strategies that colleges use, or you may have heard of schools like Northeastern, this is becoming an increasingly popular strategy, is to have students enroll in programs in Europe. You know, Northeastern has, they acquired a campus in California. They have students attending all over Europe, and those students, so when Northeastern says, like, we have a 4.6% admit rate, that admit rate is actually much higher because they're not including these students that go to the other campuses in that admit rate. So their real admit rate, I don't really know, but I would guess it's probably more like 20-25%, which is still really low, but it shows that, you know, colleges are, again, they're trying to present the numbers in a way that they think will make them look more favorable to students and families. So yield rate has an inverse relationship to a school's admit rate. So in other words, if a school is only admitting, you know, 10%, you know, they usually will have a pretty high yield rate. And if a school is admitting like 70% of applicants, they, you know, might have like a 12% yield rate because those students that are applying are also applying to a lot of other schools. So sometimes yield predictions can go wrong, and you know this can result in forced triples on campus, and you know fewer resources spread out among a range of students. Sometimes, you know, this is again why enrollment management managers' jobs are so challenging because they're supposed to get this right, and if they don't, there are repercussions on campus. I think there are times where some colleges might over-enroll on purpose, particularly if they're in some financial straits and they need the money. But I think most of these colleges that you're seeing here, it has happened in the past, but usually not intentionally. So enrollment management, I've mentioned that word. So again, what is it? So the enrollment manager, as I said, they're not just responsible for recruiting students from high school or from colleges in the case of transferring students, and getting them, you know, in and getting them to deposit. Their job doesn't really end there. So they're really responsible for, you know, the brand of the institution, you know, to make sure that there are programs in place that so current students that enroll are retained, so they'll retain in return for sophomore year. There's a lot of marketing and strategy here. So, and they're also focused on outcomes. Like they want students to graduate within 4 years. That data gets reported to the government. So it's another factor that families will look at, or we definitely look at it as consultants. So the bottom line is that, you know, colleges and universities are businesses, and this is seen through the enrollment management and admissions offices. And you know, what the experience of being a student at a college won't feel like a business, that will feel like an education, but these schools are, you know, competing for students. The other thing that colleges do, and I hinted at this earlier, they use these predictive algorithms to determine whether it's likely that a student is going to enroll. And what we're hearing at a conference last spring, the National Association for College Admissions Counseling presented, and they did talk a lot about how colleges are increasingly finding it more and more difficult to predict who will accept their offer of admission. It's made it very challenging for them. So before we get into application increases, I just want to summarize why what I just went over is important. So I want you to understand that a lot of applying to college, a student puts their best foot forward. They work hard. They take the most rigorous courses that are appropriate for them. They engage in their community. They, you know, write thoughtful essays. But at the end of the day, you know, there is a limit to how much a student can control because Colleges have their own priorities, they have their own goals, and often they don't really have anything to do with why a student is or isn't admitted. So, well, it has to do with why a student is admitted, but if a student isn't admitted, it's not because they've done anything wrong. It's just for some reason they may not have fit into what the priorities of that institution are. So applications, have been increasing at, some of the most selective colleges. So overall, the first thing is that last year there was a 7% increase in applications per student. So the students themselves are applying to more and more schools, even though they can only go to one. They're filing more applications. So as a result, like their acceptance rates um, are increasing, or actually the acceptance rates are decreasing, is what this slide should say. Sorry about that. Year over year, particularly this is being seen at larger selective colleges and universities. So a lot of state flagships. So over the past year, there's a lot of interest in those schools, and they've become more and more selective. Interesting. Last year, the slowest increase was at the most selective colleges. They didn't receive, they received more applications, but not at the rates they had in the past. And most colleges, however, accept most of their applicants. So I think what happens is there's, students, particularly in a given high school or a community, people tend to apply to many of the same schools. But there are always going to be schools that students really love that will take 60 or 70% of applicants, and they're excellent schools too. So every student should have schools like that on their college list. And as I just mentioned, it's harder than ever for the colleges to predict yield. In other words, to predict who is likely to accept their offer of admission. So this is just, and I don't want this presentation to be about highly selective colleges, but I think it's instructional just to give a sampling. You can see the comparison between in blue the 2023 cycle, and in orange the last cycle. And so you can see that applications went up, quite a bit at some schools and just a little at others, but they're going up at these very selective institutions. And what happens is, there's kind of a trickle down effect that there'll be fewer acceptances. So, you can see the admit rates here, went down at a lot of these schools. Harvard's their admit rate is still incredibly low, but it went up a tiny bit. And probably because of the protests and the turmoil around the president resigning, students may not have applied or decided to go there at the same rates as in the past. So, so that what happens there is this kind of a effect on, the applications go up, students apply to more schools, the admit rates go down at these selective school, and in part because of these increased yield rates. So because more and more students are accepting the offer of admission. So this chart just kind of explains yield a little bit more. And it starts with like inquiries, and the inquiries become applicants, but sometimes applicants don't complete their file. And then you get the applicants that complete their file, there are the acceptances, but then that their job's not done. They have to get people to deposit and confirm. And then they enroll. And then, this stealth applicant inquiries, that's when like they've never heard word one from a particular student. All of a sudden they get an application, the student's never visited. I'm not saying those students will never get in, but that happens too, and that factors in. So yeah, and then but the yield rates are going up because that's driven by, as I said earlier, the early decision, the restrictive early action plan. So just to explain the difference for those who don't know, early decision is when a student applies and they have to sign, and their parents and their school counselor sign that if they're admitted, they will go to that college. And it's frowned upon to break that in a big way. It can really hurt, other students in the future at their high school. The only acceptable reason to break an early decision agreement is if the financial aid isn't where it's at. But even in those cases, usually that can be vetted in advance. Restrictive early action is when not that many schools offer that, but that's when you're allowed to apply early, but you can't apply to early to any other private institution. So let's say you want to apply restrictive early action to Georgetown and you live in Massachusetts, you could also apply early to UMass Amherst, and you could also apply to Michigan, but you can't apply to any other private institution. You find out you get in, but you're not required to attend. You're not committed. So you can still apply elsewhere during the regular decision round and make your decision in May. So and then there's just while we're at it, there's early action, which is like you apply early, you find out earlier than the regular cycle. And there's typically not really a significant admission advantage to doing that the way there might be with early decision at some colleges. So, and then, again, why is this all happening? A lot of it, again, is due to the influence of rankings. So that's why rankings can be problematic because they kind of cause the whole system to be in a frenzy. And there are some colleges that aren't participating in rankings, but there aren't many colleges that are brave enough to do that because, again, they know that there are still many families and students that are looking at rankings. So then, then what happens? So you have, students applying to the most selective schools, and obviously not everybody's going to get in because they hardly take anyone. So then those really strong students apply to the next, for lack of a better term, the next tiers of colleges. So this is just kind of a smattering of different schools. And you can see the admit rates from the 2020 cycle to last cycle in 2024. So if you look at the very first one, in 2020, Colgate admitted 22% of applicants. And then, this most recent cycle, it was only 13. Now, they had one year, it was like 100% increase in applications. And if you ask the Colgate admissions team, they don't even know why, but that happens sometime. You see Boulder, if you look at, they went from 42,378 applications in the 2023 cycle to 68,000 in the 2024 cycle. And if any of you are football fans or New England Patriots fans, you might already know that they named Deion Sanders, a former Patriot player, as the head coach of the football team, and that is really the explanation for the increase. So we're dealing with teenagers. So if Villanova wins the NCAA basketball championship, Villanova's applications are going up. So there's a lot of things like that that happen. But you can look at this chart and you can see how certain colleges have become much more selective. I want to point out Tulane because I think it's really interesting. So you can see Tulane in 2020 had a 13% admit rate. It went to 11, then 10, and then back up to 13 in 2023 and 2024. So one of the things, this is a great example of a school that really implemented yield protection strategies. So what Tulane would do is students would apply early action. Again, that's the non-binding one, and they would get a letter that said, if you apply early decision two, they would imply like you've got a really good chance of getting in. So they would make a lot of students nervous if they really wanted to go there, and it would make them convert their application to early decision two. The other thing that they did was they really denied a lot of very strong students whose grades and test scores were well above. So I think this is a theory. I don't have evidence of this. This is a theory of mine and some of my colleagues, is that the reason their admit rate went back up is because a lot of us stopped recommending Tulane to our stronger students because we felt like they were often deferred or waitlisted. And so we would explain what was likely to happen to students, and the students would decide not to apply. We are seeing that there's been a retrenchment back out of that sort of thinking on Tulane's part, where last year strong students were getting admitted and more students were getting in early action than in the past. So we work hard to keep track of all of this kind of information, but it does change from year to year. So now we're going to shift to talk about testing. So there's been a lot of changes in testing. So the first is that the SAT is now a digital test, and it's also an adaptive test. So by adaptive, that means that they have modules and students, start in the same module. And if they get like two-thirds of the questions correct, then they go up to a harder module for the second part of the test. And if they get fewer than two-thirds, they would go to a different section. And you might think, oh, that's not fair. Like, what if somebody starts off and they're just a little rusty? But they've done a lot of research on this, and usually people end up with the scores they would have gotten even on the traditional test. So the test is also shorter now, and there are pros and cons to that. There are shorter reading passages, but the questions might be more challenging than those on the with the longer reading passages. So ACT, a couple of things are happening here. So they offer both a digital and a paper ACT. It has the same content. Digital is not offered at all test centers, so this is basically like using a computer. Where SAT allows students to bring their own computer, ACT wants the test sites to furnish the computers, which is really asking a lot of schools. So that hasn't always worked out. But the big news with ACT is that they were acquired by a private equity firm, and of course, in response to the SAT, being revised and shortened, they're going to be debuting a new test in April. They're still going to offer their former test, which they refer to as their classic test, until July of 2025. That's in the national testing centers. If sometimes schools can sponsor their own ACT, and they're going to go to October 25 in school sites. So that's a big change coming. I could spend like the whole hour on just telling you about the new ACT, and we don't have time for that. But I'll probably be writing an article for our newsletter about that, so you can learn a little bit more about it. And then many. I wouldn't say most by any stretch of the imagination, but definitely some of the selective schools did return to testing, to requiring testing in the past year. So you can see the schools that are on the left there, and I'm sorry they're not in alphabetical order, but because we kind of added them on as they made this decision. But there was a study by Dartmouth faculty, and that study claimed that um, having a test score the best predictor, along with the GPA, of how students would perform in college. There are a lot of professional organizations that have issue with that study. But I think once Dartmouth came out with that study, a lot of colleges that were on the fence about returning and requiring testing, like implemented a test requirement. At the same time, some schools are test blind, and what test blind means is they won't look at tests at all. So, the University of California system, they were always the ones that were trying to get SAT to make changes, and SAT College Board worked very closely with them over the years. But there was actually a court case, and so now there's no testing. Students can report AP scores. So right now, those are the schools that are test blind. There may be others joining. It's hard to know. And then this is of particular note for junior parents that are watching, or junior students, that there are a number of colleges that have not decided whether they're going to be test optional for the junior class, which is kind of unfair. I mean, they really should decide soon. But so if you're a student, or you're the parent of a student who's thinking of not taking a test, and one of these schools is on your list, then you may want to prepare for a test. Again, there's a holistic review. If a student has very good grades, and they have appropriate rigor for the school they're applying to, and their test scores aren't as strong, it doesn't mean they're not going to get in. So some schools like Florida, University of Florida, Florida State, they never went test optional. That it was state legislature. They always required tests. So keep that in mind as you come up with your testing plan. So just to summarize, among, like, say, the 400 most applied to colleges, about 7% require tests. So again, it's not that many. about 7% are test blind, about 60 seem to be permanently test optional, and probably about 25%, still they've extended it, but they're still deciding what their future will look like. And the advice we're giving as a result is, if you're thinking that you might want to apply to test optional, unless there's a really good reason not to, and sometimes there is a reason not to, it's probably a wise idea to prepare and take either an SAT or an ACT because, policies change, students' college lists change. Just as I mentioned earlier, the last date to take the old ACT for the national tests dates and sites is July 2025. So if you're a junior and you're figuring out your testing right now and you're doing better and liking better on the ACT, you can work with a test prep professional to help you, determine which test is the better fit for you beyond even just looking at the scores. If you decide the ACT is a better test for you, then you should probably take it because you do have until, next July to take the old classic test. If you feel you needed to test beyond that, it isn't the end of the world to take this new test, although I wouldn't choose to take that new test for the first time next fall. I think that it's too much is unknown about it. And then as far as submitting scores, so colleges typically report the middle 50% scores for their enrolled students. So that's from the 25th to the 75th percentile. And the conventional wisdom is if the school's test optional, and your scores fall in that range, then you should submit. So, now one thing that's really good to look at is to look at the percentage of students that are submitting scores to a given school. So let's take the example of Bucknell. Bucknell, about 68% of students report scores. So if you're on the borderline, but you're around the 25th percentile, I would submit the score because that's a college where most people are submitting. On the other hand, there might be another school where only about 35% of students are admitting scores. In that case, you know, it shows that they are enrolling students that didn't submit scores. And so if yours are a little out of range, it's probably in your best interest not to submit. So we very carefully guide our clients once they have a final list, before senior year about what they should be doing about that. And then the last thing is, just keep in mind that studying for a standardized test, even if you ultimately don't report it, can build skills. And I really feel like this is true in math. Some students there, one of the reasons maybe they don't do well on the math section is maybe that they were just the way they learning math facts and the automaticity never was there for them. And so, doing some prep can actually be helpful. So, you don't want to go crazy with it. You don't want to spend a year doing it, but like giving it a little try and seeing how it goes is generally a good idea. Let's talk a little bit about majors. So that's something that students don't always think about right away. So it's important to know that some colleges, obviously, a liberal arts college is just admitting you to the college. They're not necessarily admitting you to a major, and it's not like a university where there's like School of Education, School of Engineering, School of Social and Behavioral Sciences, like, where in that case you are applying to a particular school within the university. So just be aware of that. There are some universities that you apply overall, like Case Western is one. You're not necessarily applying. You might indicate a major, but you're not necessarily applying to the major. That's just how they do it. And then there are what are called impacted majors. That's a term that the University of California system uses. So majors like computer science and business, but those there can be limits on those majors at many colleges and some other majors as well. So it's important to know what those are. There are also some schools that have direct entry. So like UMass Amherst recently has adopted a new policy for the Eisenberg School of Management where you can only apply out of high school. You're no longer allowed to transfer in once a student at UMass. And there's quite a few other colleges that have similar policies. Then there's sometimes very, popular. So, you have students applying to very selective schools. Many women that are interested in STEM, they get a lot of women that are checking off biology. And if a student's interested in biology, by all means, they should apply for it. But it is important to know that there'll be a lot of other women biology applicants. So like I know I've had conversations over the years with students who came upon public health and they want to be physicians someday. But they really loved the mission of public health, and sometimes they looked for colleges that had that major. They still were going to take their core science courses that are required to apply to medical school, but they found other avenues. Now you don't want to do that in a false way. So, for example, I've had students say to me, like, I really want to go to BC, and the School of Education, somebody told me is the easiest to get into. So I'm going to apply to that. And I'll say, yeah, except like you've never babysat, you've never been a school counselor, I mean, a camp counselor, you don't tutor kids, you don't have nothing on your resume that shows any interest in children. So, it's really, you don't want to game the system. It's not going to work. Colleges are looking to see how your experience aligns with either the major or the school or college that you're selecting. And, it's okay to enter a college undecided. It's really great for students to start thinking about what excites and interests them. And we do help them think about that. But most people don't stick with the major they enter with. Some do, but a lot will change their mind. So, but that's the role of major. So that's important thing to think about as you go on your junior year journey and you start thinking more concretely about what you want to study in college. So, but first off, let me just say this is a good time to start putting questions in the chat. But, what can you do? So, students can choose the most rigorous class schedule where they'll do well, and with the emphasis on where they'll do well. So we never want to see students taking really hard classes and being up till like 1 or 2 in the morning consistently doing their homework, because that's not a recipe for good mental health or success long term. So there's so many great schools out there, and no matter what is the right level of academic rigor for a given student, they're going to have some excellent options. You want to demonstrate interest in the colleges on your ultimate college list by, visiting, and you prioritize where you're going to visit based on the schools that care about demonstrated interests. And, we guide students in understanding which schools those are. You can, if you can't get to a campus visit, there's other things you can do: interviewing, attending virtual sessions, seeing the college at a local college fair, reading their emails, things like that. uh, Students want to engage in a few meaningful activities in their school or their community. So sometimes, students will feel almost apologetic. Oh, I don't play sports. Well, that's fine. Not everybody has to play sports. Maybe they're, involved in their community at their church or their temple. Maybe they have a paid job. They do some kind of really meaningful volunteer work. So, there's no set of activities that is more meaningful. We will be doing a webinar on extracurricular activities probably in January or February. Because activities at the most selective schools, the highly selective schools, do have a different role, but too much to get into tonight. And you want to establish criteria for what you're looking for in a college, and that's something that we help our juniors do right at the start. And then teaching them how to research and see how the college match up to that criteria. So that helps students like really evaluate a school based on its offerings, and not getting distracted by like, my cousin went there, my friend's applying there, and they're really evaluating the school for who they are and how it fits them. And then, it's always good to to avoid falling in love with just one school. That doesn't mean there might not be a favorite that a student applies to. Early decision, and that's a big decision in and of itself. But it's really important to really come to like a number of schools on your list and envision yourself feeling comfortable and happy at a wide range of schools. So that is the conclusion of this presentation. So we would love to talk to you further if you're not already a client. about how we can help you guide your child and guide your child for you. You can scan the barcode below to book a consultation. My email address is also there if you'd like to take a picture of the screen. I don't know if my Zoom picture is in the way, but I will move it. Um, so yeah, so feel free to go ahead and put any questions in the chat. I'll give you a minute in case you wanted to scan this barcode and then let me take a look at what we have here. Okay, so the first question is if the school's common data set says it does not consider demonstrated interest, do we still need to read their emails, etc.? I love this question. So there is a part of me that feels like they're not always telling the truth when they say that they don't consider demonstrated interest. Like Harvard and Yale and MIT could care less about demonstrated interests. That's not how they're choosing a class, but I think there are some other schools that, that are still really selective, like maybe in the 10% range that might say that they're not interested. I don't think you have to go crazy with the emails, but if the school's a high priority to you or your child, and it's not too far away, like clear across the country, it might make sense to try to do a visit or some kind of interaction with them because let's face it, if you're like Vassar says they don't consider demonstrated interest. I'm just using Vassar as an example, but if you have two students that are similar and you're in committee and you're trying to decide who to admit, if one of them has come to campus, you might go for that one. I know it usually doesn't come down to that, but it's just a way to think about it. Um, Okay, and then the other question is, can you please repeat the part about UC system and AP scores? Yes. So when you apply to the University of California, you don't submit transcripts, you don't submit AP scores. And as I said earlier, they do not look at SAT and ACT scores. They don't look at them at all. But you can report AP, or if you're an IB program, you can report those in the application. The way they work, it's a verification system. So let's say you get into UCLA, you decide you want to go, you will then have your transcript sent and any scores that you've any AP scores you've reported, and they just do a verification. So these schools are too big to be dealing with all these kinds of documents and things like that. Um, so let's see. What does adaptive SAT mean in terms of the score? Does a student who gets adapted to easier sections and end up with a higher score? So no. So if you get adapted to easier questions because you got more than 2/3 of the questions wrong, or fewer than 2/3, I should say, then you probably chances are that student is gonna be around the 600s probably, and chances are that they probably that would be around that there on the old test as well. So, y y y my advice is to not focus on that because I think it can become a real distractor for students. I think they should approach their prep just the way they would have with the old test is like skill and drill and do your best and you're going to end up where you would have ended up anyway. Okay. I have a lot of thank yous and I really appreciate those. Are there any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat. And I really love the questions and appreciate them. So if there's any others, okay, here's one here. What would you consider a healthy number of colleges to apply to, generally speaking? So I would say it before the last, like, 3 or 4 years, we would say 8 to 10. I still think that can be a healthy number if the student has a good, solid, balanced list, but we are seeing students that are applying to more like 12 to 15 now. It's crept up a little bit, and, I think that's okay. I think that's a lot of work, but I think any more than that, the student really can't do a good quality job in their applications. And then somebody asked, does UC want the students to self-report all AP scores, or should we only report 4 and 5? I would only report 4 and 5. I think that's that makes a lot of sense. There are some schools like Princeton, I wouldn't even report 4s, but I think for the UCs 4 and 5, that makes a lot of sense. I just wanna thank everybody so much for, your joining us. It's always fun to present. I wish I could have more interaction and speak with you, but, again, please reach out, to our practice if you'd like to learn more about how we guide students. And I guess we'll wrap it up, and I thank you again. I really appreciate your time.